Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to talk about the possibility of opportunities amongst the great powers in the world today. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Ali Wyne is a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group, focusing on U.S.-China relations and great power competition. In his book, America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition, Mr. Wyne offers the first detailed critique of great power competition as a foreign policy framework. Ali Wyne, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Bill, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. Why did you decide to write this book at this particular point in time? Did you obviously it's timely, but why did you decide to write it, and what's the main thrust as far as the competition or potential competition amongst the powers?
Sure. So I first began writing the book in earnest in late 2019. So I was reflecting on the recently published National Security Strategy, the December 2017 National Security that had been published by the Trump administration, and in the subsequent month, the National Defense Strategy put out in January 2018. And when I first began writing the book in earnest in late 2019, this term great power competition, it was ubiquitous. It was a commonplace in the policymaking community, on Capitol Hill, and also in the scholarly community, in the mainstream discourse. And so I said to myself, as somebody who's interested in U.S. foreign policy, interested in world affairs, I better get a handle on this term that everyone's talking about. And what I discovered was, as I began writing the book, that while the term itself was ubiquitous, it was underspecified. And so when I would ask folks, well, what does great power competition mean? There were a lot of disagreements over its implications for U.S. foreign policy. So I set out to write the book kind of just out of curiosity. I wanted to sort of figure out, get a handle on this term. And what is a big takeaway of the book? It's a short book, so that's a plug for folks to buy the book. It's a short book, and it really it has one core takeaway, and the takeaway is that the United States has a great power opportunity to pursue a foreign policy that's rooted more in its aspirations than in its anxieties. And that is to say, of course, you look at China, a resurgent China, you look at a revanchist Russia, obviously managing those two competitors, managing strategic frictions with those competitors, it is a core task for U.S. foreign policy, and it will remain a core task for U.S. foreign policy. But I think that if you look at the competitive missteps that China and Russia have made, and perhaps we can talk about some of those, if you look at some of the competitive missteps that they have made, if you look at America's competitive advantages, on the other hand, many of which are singular, I think that there's an opportunity. We have some breathing room in light of our competitors' missteps to pursue a foreign policy that's more affirmative and that's more proactive, that focuses more on renewing our competitive advantages, articulating our vision of international order rather than just responding to the decisions of our competitors.
Very good point. What are some of the mistakes that Russia and China have made?
Well, let's begin with Russia. So there was this narrative, I would say that there was a narrative that was prevalent, and it still is somewhat prevalent in Western commentary, though not as much. But prior to February 24th, you very often encounter this narrative that, Russia under Vladimir Putin, it's stealthy, it's ubiquitous, it's behind every corrupt election, it's behind every U.S. alliance and partnership that's been undermined. There was really this perception or this narrative about Russia as being this kind of strategic, stealthy, ubiquitous strategic grandmaster. And I think that with its invasion of Ukraine, I really think that narrative has been punctured substantially. So Russia, with its invasion of Ukraine, it has certainly reminded the rest of the world that it matters. It has reminded the rest of the world that it is a major power, it is an enduring power, and it can't be ignored. But in affirming its relevance, I think it's done so at a great cost to its own strategic outlook. So what has Russia done? Russia has hemorrhaged an enormous amount of military power. Russia has undermined its own deterrence capacity. Russia has made itself even more beholden to China than it was prior to its invasion of Ukraine. Russia, basically, as long as President Putin is at the helm, it's very difficult to see any basis for rapprochement between Russia and the West. And even many advanced industrial democracies in Asia, you look at Japan, you look at South Korea, they now are taking a much cooler disposition towards Russia. And in Russia, just to make a couple of last points, even though Russia right now has been able to temporarily blunt the impact of sanctions, those sanctions are going to begin to bite more and more as time progresses. And Russia is going to find that it's more cut off from capital, more cut off from technology that it requires for its own long-term economic development. And finally, Russia's greatest fear externally has been contributing to its own encirclement. Well, what has happened as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? NATO is now poised to admit 2 new members. The European Union has granted membership candidate status to 2 countries, Ukraine and Moldova. So you look at that full litany of, or I shouldn't say full, that's a very partial litany of consequences. You look at that partial litany of consequences, which we could expand substantially, and Russia has really dug itself a significant strategic hole. Then turn to China. Now, China is certainly not as blundering as Russia. China is not as blundering. It's more cautious. It's more. It's less risk tolerant than Russia is. And yet, if you look at the diplomacy that China has conducted in recent years, and I think particularly since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, China has steadily, one after one, has alienated one major power after another. And in fact, I would say that today, the only other major power with which China has a relationship, a strengthening relationship, is with Russia. And yet, I think that many leaders in China, beginning with President Xi Jinping himself, and I'm sure many of his top advisors, increasingly look at this Sino-Russian relationship as being something of a reputational albatross around China's neck, at least when it comes to the West. But if you look at China's relationship with the United States, it's declining. The European Union is looking at China in a much sterner way. If you look at China's sort of immediate neighborhood, Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, these are major powers, major militaries, major economies. They now are increasingly counterbalancing China. So if you look at Russia, an extraordinary act of self-sabotage. You look at China steadily undercutting its relationships with most major powers. And so, again, these are formidable competitors. They're multidimensional, but I think that they're much vaunted strategic acumen. I think that the actions that Moscow and Beijing have taken kind of puncture that narrative quite a bit.
I think you're absolutely right. No foreign policy is perfect. Every country makes mistakes. You were talking,
absolutely,
you very accurately hit on Russian and Chinese challenges. What about the United States? What mistakes have we made lately that would tie into this? And by lately, I don't mean the last month, but say over the last 6, 8 years or something like that, that would hinder us from proceeding and moving forward to utilize this opportunity, take advantage of this opportunity to, well, really to manage, I guess is the best way to put it, a great power competition.
Sure. So I'll even sort of extend the aperture or the timeline that we're considering a little bit more. So if we go back to the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, kind of the heady 1990s, I'm a product of that kind of triumphalist age. I came of age in the 1990s. I think one mistake was that in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the United States, it did succumb to a kind of triumphalism. I think in part because it was relieved and simultaneously exhausted that finally this nearly half-century struggle against the Soviet Union had concluded decisively in Washington's favor. So I think that in the 1990s, and I would say you could sort of bookend it between the end of the Cold War and the onset of the global financial crisis in 2008. So kind of a 17-year period. I think that the United States succumbed to triumphalism. It discounted the competitive potential of China and Russia. So I think there's mistake one. And then certainly in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, I do think that the United States ended up going on a strategic detour. And so what began as a narrow mission, we've identified the perpetrators of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We were going to go after and target the perpetrators of those attacks. And we had a narrow mission to go into Afghanistan to identify, target, and hunt down those perpetrators. What began as a narrow, focused mission evolved into a much more sprawling, veritably global war on terrorism. And I do think that this veritably global war on terrorism, I do think that it threw the United States strategically off balance. And I think that some of the time and resources that we ended up allocating to counterterrorism could have been more effectively put to use at home in the service of internal renewal, could have also been, I think, put to better use externally in terms of mobilizing coalitions of like-minded countries to manage some of these transnational challenges, and perhaps even to establish greater trust and greater cooperative undertakings with China and Russia. So those are, I think, sort of two broader mistakes that the United States has made. But in terms of obstacles presently to seizing this great power opportunity that I discussed in the title, that I mentioned in the title and that I discussed in the book, I think that the first obstacle is a lack of recognition, perhaps, that an opportunity even has presented itself. And I think that in part there is an insufficient appreciation for that strategic opportunity. One, because there is a tendency to overcorrect. So I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the United States succumbed to triumphalism. Now I think that perhaps the pendulum has overcorrected and swung too far in the direction of consternation. Complacency isn't good, neither is consternation. We have to find a midway point. So I think that one obstacle is just recognizing that the opportunity exists. And two, and I think this is perhaps a more challenging conundrum for the United States. U.S. foreign policy for several decades now has been predicated upon and oriented around contesting external challengers. So if you go back to, say, the late 1930s, dealing with Imperial Japan, dealing with Nazi Germany, and then, of course, dealing with the Soviet Union, for a long time, the United States has framed its foreign policy in oppositional terms. How do we meet external challengers? And no less a figure than George Kennan, perhaps the foremost avatar of containment, he warned, I think very, very rightly so, he warned in the early 1990s, he gave a speech in 1994 in which he warned that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States would find itself strategically disoriented because it had spent so many decades orienting itself around external challengers. And so Kennan warned, now with the implosion of its longtime antagonist, what is the United States going to do? How is it going to define its foreign policy? And I think that one of the reasons a great power competition has come to achieve its present centrality as a policymaking framework is that with a resurgent China, with a revanchist Russia, there's a feeling, even though we feel strategic anxiety, there's a certain sense, paradoxically, of bureaucratic comfort. There's a sense that, aha, we can resume a familiar playbook. We know how to deal with external competitors. And so how do we overcome that inertia? How do we overcome that strategic inertia that is accumulated over multiple decades? And so one, we need to recognize that the opportunity exists on account of the competitive missteps of China and Russia. And two, we have to find a way of overcoming this strategic inertia that is accumulated over many decades. And those aren't going to be easy challenges to deal with.
They certainly will not be. And of course, we can look back to the past to see what did work at that time. You mentioned George Kennan and containment. We need to relook at that. It may not be the same approach today that was used years ago, especially during the Cold War.
Sure.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or you just have a computer or a podcast and you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at the opportunities and perhaps the possibility of conflict among the great powers, and how can we avoid that conflict. My guest is Mr. Wyne, who is a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group, focusing on U.S.-China relations and great power competition. And he recently wrote a book called America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. Ali, we're talking about this strategic competition, and are there what can be done, I guess specifically, what types of policies should we implement now with, say, China, Russia, and the United States? Should we involve the United Nations more? Should we be working through UN agencies? Should we be going into dialogue? We keep hearing how China, maybe Xi would like to invade Taiwan, which would be an absolute disaster. It would be difficult in some cases to have a face-to-face type of meeting. We should do it probably with Putin from Russia, simply because of his ill-advised illegal invasion of Ukraine. But what can we do specifically, these leaders of these countries, to take advantage of this opportunity and to make sure that the situation does not get to the point of competition or even out of control? And it certainly could. And if it were to do that, especially since all three of those countries have nuclear weapons, we can think of what the absolute worst disaster could be for them. But what can we do? What can each do specifically? Do you have a roadmap, 2 or 3 or 4 things that we should do now?
Well, let's begin with the dreaded scenario. Let's begin with that scenario that you just mentioned. I think any precondition, before we talk about great power cooperation, great power opportunity, we have to begin with the most solemn obligation of great power relations. The most solemn, fundamental obligation of great power relations is the avoidance of great power war. We have to begin there. And that means that as much as possible, the United States, China, and Russia strenuously have to undertake to avoid a military confrontation that could, because as you said, these are 3 nuclear armed countries, a confrontation that could theoretically and terrifyingly escalate to the nuclear level. If the United States and China were to have a great power war, if the United States and Russia were to have a great power war, I think that we would be living in a fundamentally grimmer, darker, more ominous phase of international relations. So step one is whether it is through official dialogues, unofficial dialogues, ideally leader-to-leader engagement. I'm encouraged by reports that President Biden and President Xi are likely to have a phone call, or I should say a video call in the coming days. And by the time our conversation is posted, they likely will already have had that call. So that kind of engagement is important. There are some observers who say that, well, what's the point of having that type of dialogue? These dialogues, we talk, we exchange talking points, we don't really accomplish much. I tend to take a little bit more of an optimistic view. I think that when you have the leaders of the world's two foremost powers who agree to have a conversation, they're doing so not necessarily because they believe that they're going to be able to meet each other halfway, agree on policy positions, but they're sending a signal that dialogue matters. And given how strained the U.S.-China relationship is right now, sending a signal that dialogue matters and that dialogue can continue is incredibly important. So I'm encouraged by those reports. So one, I would say that even if a dialogue doesn't necessarily bring the two sides closer, but even if it convinces the two sides a dialogue can occur, that it should continue, it's very important. So more leader-level dialogue, certainly more, and at a military level, we absolutely need to invest more in military-to-military communication between the United States and China. The United States and Russia, although right now the U.S.-Russia relationship is vastly worse than the U.S.-China relationship because of Russia's, as you said, illegal and horrific invasion of Ukraine, one of the products of the Cold War is that the United States and Russia, kind of one of the inheritances of the Cold War is that the United States and Russia, their military-to-military communication is substantially more advanced and sophisticated than that which exists between the United States and China. And so at a minimum, as bad as the relationship is between Washington and Moscow, they do at least have some kind of military dialogue. I don't know what the state of that military dialogue is right now. I don't know what the state of strategic stability talks is between Washington and Moscow, but there is, at least in theory, there is some framework, or there are frameworks that can be built upon. But between the United States and China, their military-to-military communication is far more impoverished. So we need more leader-to-leader dialogue. We need more military-to-military communication. And we need, just frankly, we need more candor. And I think that I think that any kind of conversation, as I said earlier, it has to be predicated on the recognition that a great power war would be catastrophic. That's step one. And step two, if there are limited sort of slim pickings opportunities for great power cooperation, we shouldn't turn our nose at them. We should avail ourselves of those opportunities. And again, sometimes individuals will say, well, what's the point of cooperation? Cooperation, it's a fool's errand at best, or perhaps even more, it's an exhibition of strategic weakness. I don't look at great power cooperation as signifying weakness. I look at great power cooperation as acknowledging reality. These are three powers, the United States, China, and Russia, that are going to endure. Now, one can't rule out the possibility that China might implode in spectacular fashion, or that Russia might implode in spectacular fashion, but I think it's far more likely that China and Russia are going to endure. And if you accept that proposition, that your competitors are likely to endure, then your task is not how to achieve a decisive victory. It's how do you forge and sustain a strained cohabitation. We have to find a way to get on. So even if there are limited opportunities for cooperation, whether it's on, let's say, tariff relief, perhaps some kind of cooperation on climate change, perhaps some cooperation on combating inflation or combating food insecurity. Now, those dialogues right now are probably not going to be happening as much with Russia. But even with Russia, just to take one example, as we're having a conversation right now, it looks like there might be some breakthrough between Russia and Ukraine, not on a broader détente, but on the narrower issue, but still very consequential issue of unblocking grain exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports, from Ukraine's ports in Odessa. That would be enormously important. And I think that if Russia and Ukraine are able to secure this deal to unblock grain exports from Ukraine to the extent that it could in the subsequent months, it could mitigate food insecurity, it could bring down the prices, global food prices. I think that development would be enormously consequential. So again, there might not be substantial opportunities, but if there are opportunities, we should avail ourselves of those opportunities, and we should use those as kind of confidence building measures to say, hey, we were able to cooperate on small issues. Let's see if we can expand the possibilities. I'll just make one last point and then stop. I think U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken he gave a very important speech recently laying out America's strategy towards China, and he enumerated concrete areas in which he believed that the United States and China could cooperate and must cooperate. And I think that we should be using Secretary Blinken's speech that he gave at George Washington University, in which he enumerated concrete areas for U.S.-China cooperation. We should be holding up that speech, using it as a blueprint, using it as a template for great power cooperation. I hope that although U.S.-Russia, the relationship right now is basically non-existent, at least sort of at the official level, I hope that at least privately, there are conversations that are taking place about how to ensure that escalating military tensions don't culminate in a direct war. And I hope that we can build upon this potential Russia-Ukraine grain deal to see if there are further diplomatic possibilities.
Right. And it appears that there are other discussions taking place, especially among Russian and American diplomats in regards to issues such as getting back into the Iranian nuclear deal and dealing with some of the nuclear weapons that are rumbling around the world right now and that type of thing. One term that you used in your book was a wolf warrior, and that was in reference to China. What exactly is that? What do you mean by wolf warrior?
So Wolf Warrior is the name of a film, the name of a very popular film in China, and it's basically this film. It portrays China as being much more nationalistic, much more confident, standing up for its interests and not backing down. So China will often invoke what it calls the century of humiliation, in which it was weak internally, it was invaded from the outside, and so China says, we have transcended the century of humiliation when we were weak at home, when we were vulnerable to external invasion, and now we are reclaiming our rightful place on the world stage. So Wolf Warrior, it was a very popular film in China, and so Wolf Warrior diplomacy, it's a reference to that very, very popular film, and it basically refers to a much more assertive style of diplomacy, a much more public style of diplomacy, and a much more aggressive style of diplomacy, in which Chinese leaders, Chinese officials, often with surrogates on Twitter, are pushing back much more aggressively against criticism of China's human rights abuses, much more aggressively against criticism of China's foreign policy, in which Chinese diplomats are defending China's positions much more forcefully and are hitting back much more vocally against criticism. So this wolf warrior diplomacy, it comes from an understandable place that China is now much more powerful than it has transcended that century of humiliation. It's much more powerful in comprehensive terms. But I think that the way in which China has conducted that diplomacy has proven to be quite counterproductive. So just to give some examples. So if you look at 2020, in 2020, Australia, it had the temerity to ask for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. Now, Australia is one of China's most important economic partners. Australia, under many different administrations, has really, I think, gone out of its way to accommodate China, to establish a durable relationship with China. And China really took umbrage at this call from Australia, from Canberra, for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. And in response, it slapped economic penalties on Australian exports. Very counterproductive, and I think a really disproportionate response to I think a pretty mild-mannered inquiry. Then you saw border skirmishes between China and India at their border, the deadliest border skirmishes in roughly half a century. Again, and I think that if you look at India in response to those border clashes with China, India is now moving much more to align itself much more openly and much more intentionally with the United States, both bilaterally and also under the auspices of the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. You look at Japan. Japan, under its new leadership, is also moving much more to align itself with the United States. And so I think if you look at China's conduct over the past, let's say, 2.5 years, whether it's slapping economic penalties on Australia for calling for an independent inquiry into COVID-19, they look at the border skirmishes, you look at the growing crackdown on Hong Kong, growing coercion of Taiwan, it's taken a number of steps that have really, I think, jarred major powers. And what are the consequences? The Quad, which had been kind of prior to COVID-19, this quadrilateral security dialogue, it had kind of been limping along as one of these kind of geopolitical abstractions. It now is proceeding with much clearer momentum. If you look at China's relationship with the European Union, shortly after Joe Biden was elected president of the United States, in the interval between his having won the election and his taking office, it seemed that the European Union and China were going to cross the finish line on this major investment agreement, the comprehensive agreement on investment that had been 7 years in the making. But in light of China's conduct, cracking down on Hong Kong, cracking down or intensifying its coercion of Taiwan and other steps, the European Union decided to press pause on ratifying that investment accord. NATO is now taking a much stronger stance on China. So you look at some of the steps that China has taken under the auspices of this more confident wolf warrior diplomacy, and I think that they've really backfired.
I think you're absolutely right. And you are so correct in that we have to monitor the situation and we have to be actively involved and we have to deal with people and to really engage them. We can't just say, well, we'll read about it in the newspapers or hear about it on TV and it'll take care of itself, but we have to be involved. But
Absolutely.
Wyne, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. Really an honor and a privilege.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.